Hi everyone, my name is Kira. I'm an English teacher, and in this video we're going to be doing a breakdown of a sample answer from the poetry section of paper 2, and this one is on Elizabeth Bishop from 2016. Let's jump straight in. Here's our sample answer on the left hand side, and we're going to look at the question, break it down, make sure we know which areas to focus on, look at the marking scheme and be mindful of what the examiner is looking for, and then look at each of the sections of the essay based around introduction, the main body, and then the conclusion. The question then. Bishop uses highly detailed observation of people, places, and events to explore unique personal experiences in her poetry. Discuss this statement supporting your answer with reference to the poetry of Elizabeth Bishop on your course. Okay, so the focused areas then are the observation of people, places, and events. So all of Bishop's experiences and observations of things, the world around her, people that she meets, places that she encounters, and any other kind of experiences that she has. And it's these experiences and these observations that she uses, I suppose, to explore or to kind of go further into her own personal feelings and personal experiences. So she often equates experiences and observations from the outside world with what's going on in her own mind, or inside, in kind of internal sort of conflict and things like that. So she's really looking outward to be able to explain what's happening inward, and that's kind of an overview really of a lot of her poetry. And the final part of the question is obviously the reference or the evidence, so selected poems. So we would hope that you'd be looking at least 4, maybe 5 poems on the course. Okay, the marking scheme then, just a couple of things about the codes that are going to be important. So the observation, so we're coding DO for the detailed observation. So that's the observation of people, places, and events. So any kind of observation that Bishop makes. So that's what we're looking for in her poetry. And then exploring, so EE for exploring unique personal experiences. So really the EE is exploring experiences. So how do we equate the two? So the variety of observations and then the reflections of what's happening internally or for her as personal feelings. Remember, the examiner is looking for discussion of both theme and style. So it's really important to make sure we bring in the language and the effective use of poetic devices and imagery and things like that as part of the discussion of these themes of, universal experiences and observations and things like that. Okay, so there are 2 main areas that we're going to be focusing on, the observation and then the personal. Into the introduction then. So straight away, this student is looking at the personal feelings of Bishop and looking at the insight that we get into her mind based on her past experiences. So she writes a lot about, her own experiences, like most poets do, but a lot of the poems we're going to be looking at are from her childhood or from things that have happened to her, or just even very day-to-day things like in Filling Station, that she just sort of notices things around her. So various past experiences really give us an insight into her person. Also then she uses these observations, she effortlessly creates masterpieces from seemingly banal objects or events. And again, I mentioned Filling Station, that's a really good example of that. It's just a random observation of a petrol station, effectively, just that she sees one day, and yet she manages to make an observation about these people and bring it back to her own personal feelings about motherhood and family and things like that. So personal engagement and reference to the reader. So she invites the reader to question the world around them. So again, she invites us as an audience or as readers to really get involved in these observations and to try to make our own meaning like she does. So when she observes things around her, she makes meaning. So how do we make meaning from that as well? So she's a really engaging poet, and that's why a lot of people really enjoy studying her poetry as well. So let's jump into the main body then to see how this student has dealt with each of the particular poems. So we're looking at 5 poems, and again, you might choose different ones depending on which ones you have studied, but these are 5 really nice ones to use, and they certainly all kind of encapsulate the essence of really what the question is looking for, the idea of the observations in the world around her and what it brings, or how she brings meaning to her own personal life and her personal experiences. So really making links and connections between the two. So the general observations in a way of exploring Bishop's real and personal feelings, that's the crux of the question. We want to make sure we bring in the language, poetic techniques, as I mentioned, and 1 poem per paragraph is always kind of it's a good way of approaching it, so that you don't get confused or that your structure isn't all over the place. So the fish was the first one. This is a sample from the fish point that this student made. And this student has decided to do sort of subheadings as well of the poems. You can do that if you want, but it's not necessary. You don't have to write the name of the poem at the beginning of each paragraph. So in the fish then, we have her relating to her subjects and revealing personal feelings. So she's, looking at the fish and kind of thinking about how the fish obviously has to struggle with this challenge of, being caught effectively, and how she equates that to her own life. The fish becomes a symbol then of sort of, you know, the triumph over adversity, and how the fish manages to get away and things like that, and how he has gotten away in the past because he has all of these different hooks in his mouth. So effectively, Bishop uses the observation of the fish, or the symbol of the fish, and seeing what this fish is like, in order to explain or to express her own personal feelings of overcoming adversity or overcoming challenges. So making that connection from the outside world to her inside world as well. Okay, then we also have further observations. So, you know, in a world which can be incredibly hostile, she relates to this fish. So looking at the, you know, like I said there, she brings the world around her and the fish and the environment of the fish, and everything it's gone through, she brings that back to her own personal feelings and her personal experiences. So constantly making connections between the two, the outside and the inside. Then we've got The Prodigal, a lovely poem as well, with some kind of religious references, like to the prodigal son, the kind of biblical references here as well. And again, we've got to see the personal suffering, so the shame and regret of alcoholism. So the subject of this poem is, you know, described in such a way that it's, you know, disgusting, and there's shame, and it's a heart-wrenching story of an alcoholic. It represents these problems, and obviously that's something that we know from studying Bishop that she herself struggled with. So again, using this as a subject is helping her to explore her own feelings of shame and regret. So detailed description of and the insights to this, the living conditions of this being, this prodigal. It's appalling. I mean, the description of the floor was rotten, the sty was plastered halfway up with glass smooth dung. Like, it's a really disgusting image, and you know, she really paints a picture of this awful place and these terrible living conditions. So again, they're detailed, they're insightful, and they're the kind of the observations of this particular place, but it certainly helps to reflect her own personal feelings, you know, of disgust and shame and things like that. Okay, moving on to In the Waiting Room then. So we've got, this is sort of a discussion of from young Bishop, really, from as a child, and this is her observing what it's like in a waiting room. So again, we mentioned earlier about the banal and the day-to-day normal things. This is what Bishop is all about. It's something so basic and so normal and in a daily routine, and yet she makes an observation which is then something she can equate to her own life, or that she can relate to, and try to sort of make meaning out of it. So she's looking at the National Geographic, and she's reacting to the images that she sees in the magazine, you know, that it has quite an effect on her as a young person, and this is sort of a moment where she has all these kind of realizations. So the observation there is the waiting room around her, the magazines, the, you know, the kind of objects around her in this particular atmosphere, whereas the personal feelings then is this panic and this sort of struggling realization about her own identity and who she is, and her own sexuality as well, which we know she really struggled with, especially in her younger years. So again, mixing the two things that she's seeing outside day to day, and making meaning about her own life and internalizing these things. Okay, then we have Filling Station, and I did mention this earlier in the introduction. It's one of my favourites. It's, again, looking at the idea of a very boring, very banal, obvious thing like a petrol station, you know, that's what they call filling station, something that is very normal, and yet she makes meaning and pulls tiny details out of this very normal petrol station in order to sort of say something a little bit deeper. So she captures this atmosphere. She describes the filling station. The father wears a dirty oil-soaked monkey suit. She talks about the stains and the black, the oil stains around the area and things like that. But then she also describes the little details of the wicker sofa, the dirty dog, the doily. You know, this doily she seems to be obsessed with. Why, oh why, the doily? Because why have some little pretty items, little things like that in such a dirty kind of a business, really? What's the point of it? So again, that's where she goes beyond these objects. There's a message and a feeling behind each of these objects, and we're able to go beyond seeing this filth and squalor, and she's able to sort of encapsulate really what this world actually means. And it is actually a home. It's a bit like that whole "a house doesn't make a home" sort of thing. So this family have made this kind of fairly dirty, you know, oil-soaked filling station. They've made it their home, and they've made it cozy. And this is the message. And again, it goes beyond into her own personal experiences of, you know, her family and her background and her lack of the childhood that she really wanted to have, and you know, having that love from her parents and things like that. So again, it's looking at the obvious observations of the day-to-day and making meaning on a more personal level. And this student has really captured that by using these particular quotes. So she's constantly bringing the two elements of the question together in every paragraph. Really nice personal response at the end of this point. And again, I think, like I said, I really enjoyed Filling Station. I think a lot of people do. It's quite a nice one, and it's quite easy to relate to as well. So just a nice final kind of statement at the end of the point. I find this to be an incredibly comforting and heartwarming thought, as I'm sure Bishop did. So again, it's a really nice personal response, bringing something in. So you're not just doing your two layers of the question, which this student has done effectively throughout, but also bringing in a level of your own interest and your own personal enjoyment of studying her poetry, and even in particular this poem itself. Finally then is The First Death in Nova Scotia, which was Bishop's first major kind of experience of death as a young person, as a child, and the description of her cousin who has died in very tragic circumstances. So again, it's quite an upsetting poem, but again, it's the observation of the rituals around death and funerals and things like that, are the things that she picks up on, and how she's able to make meaning and bring them to a personal side. So the personal effects, the how death can affect young people, and how not only is she sad and she's profoundly affected, but she's full of questions and she's full of confusion, which is completely natural for a young person, for anyone really who is experiencing some kind of a loss. So she really captures that quite well by bringing in that, and also explains her own personal feelings, because this did happen to her and this is how she felt. And then, like we mentioned before, then the observations, so it's through the eyes of a child. She observes the scene from the point of view of a young person, so there's an innocence to it. It's not just someone describing a funeral or describing what everyone's doing and what the coffin looks like. And then she describes the corpse in a very innocent way, in a very naive way, and she describes the coffin, and even she notices these details in the living room that most people wouldn't notice because they're at a wake. So that's really, really nice, and it really again, it makes it really effective. It makes the poem really interesting, but it also helps her to suggest these personal feelings through looking at the observations of the atmosphere and the actual surroundings of this event. I would just say, maybe to conclude this point, by explaining the quote, because she finishes on, "But how could Arthur go?" which I suppose in itself is a question that's unanswered, and maybe it's inexplicable to this child, but maybe just a nice concluding remark there to suggest that this is one of the unanswered questions of the child Bishop, that she had, and she wasn't able to answer, and it kind of left her with a sense of confusion. Just thought it might be a nice way to kind of round off the point, but otherwise really nice use of quotation in this paragraph as well. Okay, that covers our 5 main poems really then. So we're just into our conclusion and just pulling it all together. Keep it short and sweet. You've already made all the points. The 5 poems have been really well dealt with, and we've seen that in every single poem she's looked at each aspect of the question, whether it's the observations of the world around her or the exploration of the personal feelings. So again, we're just going to quick mention of the personal feelings. So a sense of meaning and importance. So she really does make meaning from the things that she sees in the outside world, and she internalizes them. Her poems are deeply personal. We know that a lot of these things are very much autobiographical, like they happened to her or she experienced them, and that's what she writes. She writes about what she knows, like most poets. The observations then, they're banal objects, places or people. Well, obviously the banal objects like the magazines in the waiting room, or the places are, say, like the petrol station, for example, or the people, some of the people in First Death in Nova Scotia perhaps. And obviously the banal objects like the fish, it's just a normal fish, and yet she really makes it more than being banal. It makes it extra special as well. So these very boring, very day-to-day observations, how she brings them to life and how she makes meaning from them and how she relates to them. And then a final couple of comments on personal engagement. The student, I've thoroughly enjoyed, I hugely admire, and she's able to relate to, and she said that generally the experience of studying this poetry was enjoyable. So lots of nice little phrases there to show that the student has engaged and has been, influenced and affected by studying this poetry. So a really nice conclusion, a very strong essay overall, really nice use of quotation throughout, and most importantly, constantly referring back to the question, most important thing of all. Okay, that brings us to the end. For the full sample answer and for an annotated view, please go to studyclix.ie.